The organ music was a physical weight, pressing down on Leona's shoulders as she walked. Each booming note vibrated through the marble floor, up through the soles of her too tight satin shoes, and into her bones. The dress was a cage of ivory silk and lace, chosen by a stranger for a life she had not asked for. It was beautiful, impossibly expensive, and felt like a shroud. Ahead, past the sea of blank, staring faces, he waited. Ryo Tanaka. He was not a man so much as a monument carved from shadow and stillness. Dressed in a black suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed fused to his frame, he stood with an unnerving placidity at the altar. From this distance, she could see only the severe line of his shoulders and the dark gloss of his hair. He did not turn.
He did not need to.
The entire cathedral, with its soaring arches and stained-glass saints, felt like it was holding its breath for him. Leona kept her eyes fixed on that unmoving silhouette. It was easier than looking at the guests. On one side, rows of severe-looking Japanese men in dark suits, their faces impassive, their watchfulness a palpable force. On the other, a smattering of city officials and business leaders, their curiosity warring with their fear. They were all here to witness the union, the alliance, the sacrifice. The city's most powerful monster marrying its most visible tragedy. That's what the gossip blogs had called her. The papers were kinder, using phrases like reclusive and unfortunate. But Leona knew what they meant. She felt their eyes on the left side of her face, tracing the raised, discolored skin of her scars. They ran from her temple, across her cheek, and down her neck, a permanent, puckered map of the fire that had defined her life. She clutched the bouquet of white lilies so tightly she could feel the stems bruising against her palms. Her father had given her away at the back of the church, his hand trembling, his eyes slick with the weak, self-pitying tears she had come to despise. He had sold her. For gambling debts and a clean slate, he had handed his only daughter over to the head of the Tanakagumi. She reached the altar, the scent of lilies and old stone thick in the air. Now, she was close enough to see the details of the man she was about to marry. The perfect knot of his silk tie. The sliver of a brilliant, intricate tattoo, a dragon scale, perhaps, peeking from the cuff of his stark white shirt. And his eyes. When he finally turned his head, his eyes met hers, and the air left her lungs. They were not black, as she had expected, but a deep, cold brown, as dark and unreadable as a forest at midnight. There was no welcome in them. No emotion at all. Just a flat, assessing calm that made her feel like an object, a piece on a board. He was taking inventory. The priest's voice droned on, a meaningless river of words about love and fidelity. Leona felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching a scene from a tragic play. Ryo's hand came to take hers, and his touch was like ice. His skin was smooth, his grip firm and impersonal, a simple transfer of ownership. He did not look at her again. His focus remained forward, on the golden cross glinting in the candlelight, as if this ceremony were a tedious but necessary business transaction.
And it was.
She knew that. 2 weeks ago, her world had been quiet, ordered. It had been the scent of old paper and leather bindings in the city archive where she worked, the silent satisfaction of restoring a forgotten piece of history. Then her father had appeared at her apartment door, his face ashen, the smell of stale whiskey clinging to his expensive suit. He had confessed everything in a torrent of pathetic sobs, the debts to the wrong people, the threats against his life, his career. He had ruined himself. And then he told her of the solution he had found. The offer he had made. The head of the Tanakagumi needed a wife. A specific kind of wife. An outsider. Someone with no connections to his world, whose presence would signal peace to his rivals, not a consolidation of power. A bride so unassuming, so completely devoid of political or social capital, that her elevation could not possibly be seen as a threat. In a city that worshipped beauty, her father had offered up the one thing he had left to value, his famously ugly daughter. Leona had listened, her heart turning to a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The alternative was her father's destruction, a violent, messy end that would splatter onto her as well. She had a choice: watch him die, or step into the cage.
So she had stepped.
Rio's men had been professional, quiet. They had moved her out of her small apartment, managed the press, arranged the dress, the church, the entire monstrous spectacle. "I do," Rio said. The words were not a promise. They were a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the marble floor. The priest turned to her. All eyes were on her. She could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes, all of them dissecting her, pitying her, judging her. She looked at the man beside her, at the sharp line of his jaw, the absolute control in his posture. This was her life now. A gilded cage, with a predator for a keeper. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was a ghost of her own voice. "I do," a murmur went through the crowd. The contract was sealed. He was hers and she, irrevocably, was his. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of a hotel Rio owned. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting a cold, glittering light over the assembled guests. The tension was a low hum beneath the polite chatter and the string quartet playing in the corner. Leona sat at the head table on a throne-like chair, a plate of exquisite food she couldn't eat placed before her. Rio was not beside her. He moved through the room with a silent, lethal grace, a shark navigating his own waters. He spoke in low tones to his lieutenants, his face an impassive mask. He accepted congratulations from city politicians with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He did not once look her way. She was a prop he had acquired, and having served her purpose at the ceremony, she was now set dressing. The whispers followed her even here. She could feel them, see the sideways glances, the hands covering mouths. They saw the scarred girl in the princess dress, seated beside an empty throne, and they drew their own conclusions.
Pity. Scorn.
A morbid curiosity. She focused on a point on the far wall, a large, abstract painting of swirling blues and golds, and let their voices blur into white noise. This was an exercise in endurance. That was all. A man approached the table, his smile too wide, too slick. He was younger than Rio, handsome in a way that felt predatory, and wearing a suit that was just a little too flashy. She recognized him from the wedding. He had been seated in the front row with the other faction. This was Kenji Ishikawa, the son of Rio's primary rival. "The beautiful bride," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He let his eyes travel over her, lingering on her scars with theatrical pity. "My father sends his deepest congratulations. He hopes your union is fruitful." The threat was barely veiled. Leona said nothing, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "It's a bold move, I'll admit," Kenji continued, leaning closer, his cologne cloying and cheap. "For a man like Tanaka to choose someone so pure, so untouched by our world. It makes a man wonder, is he trying to appear weak? Or has he simply lost his taste?" Before Leona could even process the insult, a presence solidified behind her. The temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Kenji's smug smile faltered, his eyes widening slightly as he looked over her shoulder. Rio had materialized without a sound. He placed a hand on the back of Leona's chair, his knuckles brushing her shoulder. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. It was the first time he had touched her voluntarily. "Ishikawa," Rio said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the ballroom's noise like a razor. "My wife is not accustomed to the stench of your desperation. I suggest you move along before you sour her appetite." Kenji paled, the slick bravado evaporating. He straightened up, gave a jerky bow, and retreated back into the crowd. Rio remained for a moment, his hand resting on her chair. She could feel the warmth of his body at her back, a solid wall of heat and power. He had defended her, not out of affection, she knew, but out of possessiveness. An insult to her was an insult to him. She was his property now. He leaned down, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Do not speak to him again, then." As silently as he had appeared, He was gone, moving back into the heart of his empire. The drive to his penthouse was silent. The city lights smeared past the tinted windows of the black sedan, a world away from the suffocating quiet inside the car. Rio sat across from her, his face cast in shadow, looking out his own window. The wedding was over. The performance was done. Now, something else was beginning, and the dread that had been a low hum all day was now a screaming siren in her mind. The penthouse was a shock of cold, minimalist perfection. It occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, black skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling living space with floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing a breathtaking panorama of the glittering city below. The floors were polished black marble, the furniture sparse and brutally modern, low-slung leather sofas, chrome and glass tables. There were no photographs, no clutter, no sign of a life lived. It was less a home and more a fortress, a monument to wealth and absolute control. Rio walked ahead of her, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He didn't offer her a tour. He led her down a long, white hallway to a single door. "This will be your room," he stated, not a question. He pushed the door open, revealing a bedroom suite larger than her entire old apartment. It was as impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, dominated by a massive bed draped in stark white linens. A wall of glass offered the same stunning city view, but it felt like looking out from a cage. "Your belongings have been delivered. Anything you require, you can ask the staff. They are available 24 hours a day." He stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the bright hall. He made no move to enter. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken questions. This was it. The wedding night. The culmination of the contract. Leona's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. She expected him to step inside, to close the door, to claim the final part of his purchase. Instead, he remained where he was, his expression unreadable. She turned her back to him, walking towards the window to buy herself a moment. She wrapped her arms around herself, the silk of the dress feeling cold and foreign against her skin. She could feel his eyes on her back, an almost physical pressure. She was an archivist. She understood the value of things, the stories they told. This man had acquired her like a rare, if damaged, artifact. What story did he think she told? What did he expect from her now? Tears? Pleading? A frightened, submissive girl grateful for the protection of his name? She would give him none of it. With a deep breath, she began the slow, methodical process of unfastening the dozens of tiny, pearl buttons that ran down the back of the wedding dress. Her fingers were clumsy, but she worked with a deliberate focus, refusing to show any sign of the terror churning in her stomach. The dress finally loosened, pooling around her feet in a whisper of silk. She was left in the simple slip she wore beneath. She did not turn around. She stood, exposed and vulnerable, and waited. He expected fear. Rio Tanaka was a connoisseur of it. He saw it every day in the eyes of his enemies, his allies, his employees. It was the currency of his world. He had seen it in her father's pathetic, trembling form. He had expected to see it in her tonight. He anticipated a night of quiet, frightened tears, of a woman who would shrink from his touch and endure her fate with miserable submission. He had steeled himself for the unpleasantness of it, a necessary consummation to seal the public nature of their contract. So, when she did not cry, he waited. When she did not plead, he observed. And when she turned from the window to face him, her chin held high, the scarred planes of her face illuminated by the city lights, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time: surprise. She met his gaze directly. There was no fear in her eyes. There was a deep, quiet resolve he did not understand. She was not beautiful.
The city was right about that.
Her body was full and soft, not the lean, hard shape of the women who usually occupied his world. And the scars were stark, a brutal interruption of the smooth, dark skin of her cheek and neck. But her eyes held a strength that was almost a challenge. Then she did something that shattered his expectations completely. She walked towards him. Not seductively. Not hesitantly. She moved with a strange, calm purpose, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he could smell the faint scent of lilies clinging to her hair. He stood frozen, a statue of surprise, as she lifted her hands. He thought she might strike him, a futile gesture of defiance. Instead, her fingers went to the top button of his shirt. Her touch was cool and steady. With the meticulous precision of a scholar handling a priceless manuscript, she began to unbutton his shirt. One by one, the buttons gave way. He was so taken aback by the sheer audacity of the act that he did not stop her. No one touched him without permission. No one. Yet he allowed it. He allowed her to peel back the layers of his armor, the tailored suit, the crisp shirt, until his chest was bare to the cool night air. Her eyes were not on his face. They were on his skin, cataloging the ink that covered him. Her gaze followed the swirling lines of the dragons and clouds that were the mark of his clan, a story of power and violence written on his body. Her expression was not one of disgust or fear. It was one of intense, scholarly curiosity, as if she were reading him. Then her fingers, light as a breath, traced a line over his heart, away from the elaborate tattoos. They stopped on a different kind of mark, a thick, jagged scar, old and white against his skin, a permanent flaw in the masterpiece of ink. It was the one mark on his body that was not of his own choosing. His control, stretched taut by her inexplicable behavior, finally snapped. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was like steel. "What are you doing?" he bit out, his voice a low growl. She finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. She did not flinch from his anger, did not even seem to register the threat in his grip. "I wanted to see," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They call you a monster. Monsters don't have scars like this. Men do." The scar was a secret history, a chapter he never reread. It was from a lifetime ago, from a night of fire and shattered glass, a night that had ended with the woman he was supposed to marry, Akemi, bleeding out in his arms. It was a testament to his greatest failure. He had built an empire of fear and control so that no one could ever touch him again, so that he would never again be so weak as to fail to protect what was his. And this woman, this stranger he had married for convenience, had laid it bare with a single touch in less than an hour. He released her wrist, as if her skin had burned him. A muscle jumped in his jaw. Leona's quiet statement hung in the air between them, more powerful than any weapon. "Monsters don't have scars like this. Men do."
She saw him.
Not the Yakuza boss, not the head of the Tanakagumi, but the man beneath the ink and the reputation. It was intolerable. "This marriage is a contract," he said, his voice cold and clipped as he pulled the edges of his shirt back together. "It is for appearances. Nothing more. You will have your freedom within these walls. You will want for nothing. In return, you will play the part of my wife in public. That is the extent of our relationship." He turned his back on her, needing to put space between them, to rebuild the walls she had so effortlessly breached. He walked towards the door, his mind racing. He had miscalculated. He had chosen her because he thought she would be simple, manageable, a broken thing he could place on a shelf. But she was not broken. She was forged. There was a difference. A dangerous difference. "I will take the adjacent suite," he said without turning around. "We will not share a room." It was not a punishment. It was a retreat. As his hand touched the doorknob, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A single, sharp vibration. He pulled it out. A one-word text from his second-in-command, Ishikawa. His jaw tightened. It was a report of an attack. A coordinated strike on one of his warehouses near the port, a blatant challenge made on his wedding night. The truce was already a sham. He had to go. He had to respond with surgical, overwhelming force. He put the phone away and glanced back over his shoulder. Leona hadn't moved. She stood in the middle of the vast, empty room, wrapped in her simple slip, watching him. The look in her eyes was no longer just resolve. It was something else. Something unsettlingly close to understanding. He had brought her into his world to be a symbol of peace. He was beginning to realize he may have just armed a ghost. He left without another word, the click of the door echoing the sudden, violent shift in his world. Leona stood alone in the silent room for a long time after he left. The echo of the closing door faded, replaced by the distant hum of the city far below. He was gone. The immediate threat of his presence had receded, but the tension remained, clinging to the air like a fine dust. She was his wife. She was a prisoner in a glass tower. She was also, apparently, going to be left alone. She walked over to the bed and sank onto the edge of the mattress. It was soft, yielding, a stark contrast to the man who owned it. He had retreated. She had touched his scar, and he had run. It was a vulnerability, a crack in the obsidian facade. She filed the information away, the archivist in her cataloging the data point. She was not the only one in this marriage with scars. For hours, she did not sleep. Instead, she explored. She left her suite and padded silently down the long, white corridor. The penthouse was a labyrinth of taste and emptiness. She found a state-of-the-art gym she would never use, a home theater with a screen the size of a car, and 3 guest suites, all as pristine and soulless as her own. Then she found his office. The door was unlocked. She hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, this room felt lived in. One wall was a bank of monitors, some showing security feeds, others displaying complex financial data. But the other 3 walls were lined with bookshelves, floor to ceiling. The books were not for show. They were a mix of Japanese and English titles, their spines showing signs of wear. She ran her fingers over them. Histories of the Sengoku period, biographies of military strategists, first editions of classic literature, treatises on economics and political theory. A volume of Basho's poetry sat next to a thick book on corporate acquisition law. This was the mind of the man she had married, a complex, contradictory library of violence, art, and ruthless ambition. She could have looked for a way out. A service elevator, a hidden staircase. The thought crossed her mind, a fleeting, instinctual impulse. But where would she go? Back to her father, who had sold her. Out into a city where she was now marked as the property of Ryo Tanaka, a target for his enemies? There was no escape. She knew that. The moment she had said, "I do," her old life had been archived, filed away forever. So she made a choice. Not to run, not to hide, but to understand. If this was her new reality, she would learn its rules. She would study its king. She pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, a history of the samurai code, Bushido, and settled into the large leather chair behind his massive, empty desk. The leather was cool against her skin. She opened the book and began to read. She must have fallen asleep, because the next thing she knew, the darkness of the office was softer, diluted by the first gray light of dawn. A weight was across her shoulders. She looked down and saw a heavy, cashmere blanket, charcoal gray, tucked around her. It smelled faintly of him, a clean, sharp scent of cedar and something else, something metallic and cold, like winter air. She looked up. Ryo stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the waking city. He was still in the suit from the night before, though the tie was gone and his collar was unbuttoned. He must have returned while she slept. He must have found her here, in his chair, in his private sanctum. And he had not woken her. He had not thrown her out. He had covered her with a blanket. The gesture was so at odds with the man who had looked at her with such cold fury just hours before that she didn't know how to process it. It was a small thing, almost deniable, but in a world as hard and cold as his, it felt like a seismic event. A week passed in quiet, tense observation. Leona and Ryo existed in separate orbits within the vast penthouse. They rarely saw each other. He would be gone before she woke, and he would return late, disappearing into his own suite. The only evidence of his presence was the faint scent of cedar in the hallway and the occasional sound of a low, tense phone call from behind his office door. The household staff, a silent, efficient team, treated her with a flawless, deferential politeness that was its own kind of wall. She had everything she could want: food, clothes, books, and nothing she needed. Freedom, purpose, human connection. She spent her days in his library, devouring his books, trying to piece together the man from the fragments he left behind. She was studying him, and she knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that he was studying her. The security staff reported her every move. He knew which books she read, what she ate, that she never once tried to leave. One afternoon, a delivery arrived. It was not the usual groceries or supplies. A uniformed courier, his face pale and sweating despite the air conditioning, delivered a single, lacquered black box to the head of security, who then brought it to Leona, where she sat in the library. "A gift for you, ma'am," the guard said, his voice carefully neutral. He placed it on the table in front of her and retreated. It was not from Rio. The box was cold to the touch. With a sense of rising dread, she lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of black silk, lay a single, perfect white orchid. Its petals were bruised, and a dark, ugly rot was beginning to creep up its stem. It was dying. But it wasn't just an orchid. Leona had seen a photograph of one just like it on Rio's desk, a small, framed picture tucked behind a stack of papers. A picture of a smiling young woman, Akemi, with a white orchid tucked behind her ear. This was a message. Rio appeared in the doorway of the library, his presence sucking the air from the room. He must have been watching her on the security monitors. His eyes went from her face to the box, and his expression, usually so impassive, turned to one of glacial fury. The coldness that radiated from him was terrifying. "It's from Ishikawa," he said. It was not a question. Leona looked from the dying flower to Rio's face. She saw the rage, but beneath it, she saw the ghost of that old scar. The failure. The fear that history was repeating itself. She saw the woman in the photograph, another bride-to-be, another pawn in their games, who had ended up dead. And in that moment, she was not afraid. She was furious. She was not Akemi. She would not be a ghost. "They think I'm your weakness," she said, her voice low and steady, imbued with a cold anger that surprised even herself. She pushed the box across the table towards him. "Show them they're wrong." Rio stared at her, the storm in his eyes momentarily stilled by her response. He had expected her to be terrified, to cry, to demand protection. He had not expected her to meet his rage with her own. He had not expected her to see the move on the board and suggest a counterattack. She had just crossed a line, leaving the role of victim behind and stepping into the role of an ally, a queen in his brutal game. He walked slowly to the table and looked down at the dead flower. His jaw was a hard, tight line. "Akemi was afraid," he said, the words rough, as if torn from his throat. It was a confession, an admission of a truth he had probably never spoken aloud. He looked at Leona, his gaze intense, searching. You're not. I do not understand you." "You don't have to understand me," she replied, her voice unwavering. "You just have to win." The war began in earnest. The dead orchid was the first shot. Rio's response was a swift, silent, and devastating campaign against the Ishikawa Gumi's operations. Shipments disappeared from docks. Accounts were frozen. Key lieutenants vanished without a trace. The city's underworld held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Through it all, Leona remained inside the glass tower, a queen in a gilded cage. But something had changed between her and Rio. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged. He started taking his evening meal with her in the formal dining room. They ate in near silence, but his presence was a constant, heavy weight. He would watch her, his dark eyes assessing, questioning. He was trying to solve the puzzle of her. She was no longer just the unfortunate girl he had married. She was a variable he hadn't accounted for, a piece on the board that had started moving on its own. One evening, they were forced to appear in public together. A charity gala at the city's Contemporary Art Museum, an event crawling with the city's elite. It was a neutral ground, a place where even rivals had to maintain a veneer of civility. Leona wore a simple, elegant black gown, a stark contrast to the glittering dresses around her. Rio, in a dark suit, stayed close to her side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The touch was a brand, a clear signal to everyone present. She is mine. They moved through the crowded gallery, a pocket of cold silence in the sea of noise. The air was thick with tension. She could feel the eyes of Ishikawa's men on them, could see Kenji Ishikawa watching them from across the room, his face a mask of hate. "We should not have come," she murmured, her voice low. "Showing fear is a concession," Ryo replied, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "We are not afraid." Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a nervous tittering. A power outage. But Leona knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was no accident. The emergency lights kicked in a second later, casting the gallery in a hellish red glow. And then the chaos erupted. The sound was unmistakable.
Gunfire.
Screams tore through the air as people scrambled for cover, a stampede of panic and terror. Ryo's reaction was instantaneous. He threw her to the ground behind a large, ridiculous metal sculpture, his body covering hers like a shield. The world devolved into a blur of noise and violence. The sharp crack of gunshots, the shattering of glass, the metallic scent of cordite filling the air. Ryo's men, positioned discreetly throughout the gallery, moved with brutal efficiency, returning fire. Peeking from under Ryo's arm, Leona saw one of Ishikawa's men break from the main firefight, his eyes fixed on them. He was flanking them, moving to get a clear shot. Ryo was pinned, focused on two other attackers in front of them. He hadn't seen the third man. There was no time to scream a warning. Acting on pure instinct, Leona remembered the museum layout from the brochure she'd studied earlier. She knew where the fire alarms were. She shoved against Ryo's weight. "Trust me," she hissed. Surprised, he shifted just enough. She scrambled out from behind the sculpture, low to the ground, and slammed her hand against the red fire alarm box on the wall. The piercing shriek of the alarm blared through the gallery, followed by the hiss of the overhead sprinklers. Water rained down, drenching everything, adding to the chaos and confusion. She didn't stop. The flanking attacker, momentarily disoriented by the alarm and the water, turned his attention to her. He raised his weapon. Leona grabbed the base of a ridiculously top-heavy modern art piece next to her, a precarious stack of polished granite cubes, and threw all her weight into it. It toppled with a deafening crash, not hitting the man directly, but forcing him to leap back, his footing slipping on the wet floor. That was the only opening one of Ryo's guards needed. A single, silent shot and the threat was gone. Leona stood, drenched and shaking, in the middle of the pandemonium she created, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had not screamed. She had not hidden. She had acted. The firefight was over in moments. The silence that fell was more shocking than the noise. It was a wet, dripping silence, broken by the last groans of the dying and the steady hiss of the sprinklers. Ryo's men were securing the room, their movements swift and professional. The survivors of Ishikawa's ambush were either dead or captured. Ryo rose to his feet, his dark suit soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked every inch the predator, untouched by the violence he had just orchestrated. He scanned the room, his eyes cataloging the damage, the bodies, the victory. Then his gaze found Leona. She was standing beside the toppled sculpture, water dripping from her hair and down her face, mixing with the tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. She wasn't crying from fear, but from the raw, jagged shock of it all. He walked towards her, ignoring everyone and everything else. He stopped in front of her, his presence blocking out the entire chaotic scene. He looked at the fire alarm she had pulled, at the fallen sculpture, at the dead attacker just feet away. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask was completely gone. In his eyes, she saw a raw, turbulent mix of fury, astonishment, and something else she dared not name. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "You," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You were supposed to be the one thing in my world that was not a weapon." She met his gaze, her own turmoil reflected in the dark depths of his. She had saved herself. In doing so, she had protected him, not just from a bullet, but from the ghost of his past failure. She had proven she was not a Kami. She was not a weakness to be sheltered. She was a force to be reckoned with. Your world doesn't allow for anything else, she replied, her voice shaking only slightly. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. His men were already fading into the shadows, preparing their exit. This was their world now. Shared violence. Shared survival. He didn't say anything more. He simply took her hand, his grip firm and possessive, and led her through the carnage, away from the approaching lights of the world they had left behind. As they stepped out into the rain-slicked night, leaving the gallery of death behind them, Leona knew that the contract had been irrevocably broken. A new one had been forged in its place, written in gunfire and water, sealed not with a vow, but with a shared, brutal truth. He had married a pawn. He was leaving with a queen. Back in the silent penthouse, they stood dripping on the black marble floor of the entryway. The staff had vanished. The fortress was theirs alone. Rio finally released her hand. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the water tracing paths over her skin, catching on the raised edges of her scars. He saw the strength in her eyes, a fire that no one, not even him, could quench. "My father sold me," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment in the vast, silent room. "This city called me ugly. You married me as a pawn to be sacrificed." He took a step closer, closing the small space she had tried to keep between them. His gaze was a physical touch, intense and unwavering. "The deal was for a wife in name only," he said, his voice low, final. "The deal has changed." He reached out, not with the cold impersonality of their wedding day, not with the possessive grip of the gala, but with a new, deliberate reverence. His fingers, so capable of violence, traced the largest of her scars, the one that curved along her cheekbone. His touch was not one of pity. It was one of awe, of recognition. "You are not a pawn," he said, his thumb stroking her skin, sending a tremor through her entire body. "You are the queen." It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous, far more real. It was a claim, a coronation. In the heart of his cold, brutal empire, he was acknowledging her power, her place. Not beside him, but with him. Leona did not pull away. She held his gaze, her heart hammering a new, steady rhythm. The cage was gone. The throne was hers. And as his head lowered towards hers, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was not just surviving. She was beginning to rule.